Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into a story that'll grip your heart and chill your bones. A dog's relentless cry unraveled an unthinkable truth. Picture this: a lonely man, a loyal dog, and a secret buried under an old oak tree, waiting to be uncovered. This isn't just a tale. It's an emotional roller coaster packed with love, loss, and a twist of horror that'll leave you speechless. Elias thought he knew his life, but when his dog Rusty starts barking like never before, everything changes. What's hidden in the shadows? What truth has been waiting all these years? You'll have to watch to find out. If you love stories that make you feel and keep you on edge, hit that like button right now. It really helps us out. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an update. And if this story moves you, share it with your friends. Let's get everyone talking about Rusty's cry and the unthinkable truth it reveals. Ready? Let's get started. The village of Ashwood was a forgotten speck on the map, nestled between rolling hills and dense, whispering woods. Its streets were narrow, lined with crooked cottages that seemed to lean into one another for support. At the very edge of this quiet place stood an old house, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of time. The paint, once a cheerful yellow, had faded to a sickly gray, peeling away in long curling strips like the skin of some ancient beast. This was Elias's home, a man who had lived there for decades, first with his wife, Clara, and now alone, save for the company of his dog, Rusty. Rusty was a scruffy little mutt, with a coat the color of damp earth and eyes that held a quiet, soulful depth. He wasn't much to look at, his ears flopped unevenly, and one of his front legs bore a slight limp from an old injury. But to Elias he was everything. 3 years ago, Clara had slipped away from this world, taken by a sudden fall down the stairs in the dead of night. The loss had hollowed Elias out, leaving him a shell of the man he'd once been. Rusty, though, had stayed by his side, a constant presence that kept the silence from swallowing him whole. The dog slept at the foot of his bed, followed him to the kitchen each morning, and sat patiently as Elias muttered to himself over cups of coffee that always went cold before he finished them. That morning, however, something was different. The sun had barely crept over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pale gold, when Rusty began to bark. It wasn't the usual sharp yelp he let out when a squirrel darted across the yard, or when the postman's truck rumbled by. This was a deep, insistent sound, raw and jagged, like a cry torn from the dog's very soul. Elias, slumped in his worn armchair by the kitchen window, barely registered it at first. He cradled his coffee mug, the steam long gone, and stared blankly at the cracked linoleum floor. "Quiet down, boy," he grumbled, his voice rough from disuse. He figured Rusty had spotted something trivial, a bird, a shadow, a gust of wind stirring the leaves. Dogs barked, it was what they did. But Rusty didn't stop. The barking grew louder, more urgent, spilling out into the crisp autumn air and bouncing off the walls of the house. Elias shifted in his seat, a flicker of irritation sparking in his chest. He wasn't a man of patience anymore. Grief had worn that away, leaving behind a brittle shell of a person who preferred the stillness of his own thoughts to the chaos of the world outside. He took a sip of the cold coffee, wincing at its bitterness, and tried to tune out the noise. Minutes stretched into hours, and still, Rusty barked. By mid-morning, the sound had become a rhythm, a relentless drumbeat that pulsed through the house and rattled Elias's nerves. He stood, his knees creaking like the floorboards beneath him, and shuffled to the window. The glass was smudged with years of neglect, but he could make out Rusty's small form in the yard. The dog was pacing near the old oak tree, a towering gnarled thing that had stood there longer than Elias had been alive. Its branches stretched out like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows across the patchy grass. Rusty's head was low, his tail stiff, and his barks came in sharp, staccato bursts. Elias frowned. This wasn't normal. Rusty wasn't a noisy dog by nature. He'd always been quiet, content to sit and watch the world go by. Something had set him off, something Elias couldn't see. The air outside felt heavy when Elias finally stepped onto the porch, the chill of late October seeping through his thin sweater. He pulled it tighter around his frail frame, his breath fogging in front of him. "Rusty," he called, his voice cracking from lack of use. The dog didn't even glance at him. Instead, Rusty kept his eyes fixed on the ground beneath the oak, his paws scraping at the dirt, as if trying to dig his way to some hidden truth. Elias's irritation gave way to unease. He'd lived in this house for nearly 40 years, and he knew every creak, every draft, every quirk of the land. But today, it felt foreign, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He remembered how Clara used to love that oak tree. She'd sit beneath it on warm afternoons, a book in her lap, her laughter floating through the air like music. After her death, Elias had avoided the spot. It was too painful, a reminder of everything he'd lost. Now, watching Rusty circle it with such ferocity, he felt a pang in his chest, a mix of sorrow and something darker, something he couldn't name. The barking was relentless now, a sound that clawed at his mind and stirred memories he'd buried deep. Clara's face flashed before him, her warm smile, her gentle hands, the way she'd call Rusty over to pet his scruffy head. And then the image shifted, her lifeless body at the bottom of the stairs, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, Rusty whining beside her. Elias shook his head, trying to dispel the memory. "Enough, boy," he snapped, louder this time, but Rusty only paused for a moment before resuming his cries. The sound was unbearable now, a desperate plea that seemed to echo beyond the yard, into the woods that loomed at the edge of the property. Elias's hands trembled as he gripped the porch railing. His heart thudded unevenly, a dull ache spreading through his chest. He didn't want to go out there. He didn't want to know what had driven Rusty to this madness. But the dog's eyes, those deep pleading eyes, locked onto his, and Elias felt a pull he couldn't ignore. By noon the barking had worn him down. He couldn't sit in the house any longer, couldn't pretend it was nothing. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, and stepped fully into the yard. The wind bit at his face, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Rusty's voice was hoarse now, but no less determined, and as Elias approached, he saw the dog's claws had churned up the soil beneath the oak. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen tension, and Elias's gut twisted with a dread he hadn't felt since the night Clara died. Whatever Rusty was trying to tell him, it was about to change everything. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, its light filtering through the bare branches of the old oak tree in weak, golden streaks. Elias stood in the yard, his coat pulled tight against the biting wind, watching Rusty with a growing sense of unease. The little dog had been barking all day, his voice now a ragged shadow of its usual strength, but he showed no signs of stopping. His small body trembled with effort as he paced beneath the oak, his paws digging into the soft earth, his brown eyes fixed on something Elias couldn't see. The air was thick with tension, a weight that pressed down on Elias's shoulders and made his breath come in shallow bursts. "Rusty, come on now," Elias called, his voice softer this time, tinged with worry rather than the irritation he'd felt earlier. He took a step closer, his boots sinking slightly into the damp grass. The dog didn't respond, not with a wag of his tail, not with a glance in Elias's direction. Instead, Rusty let out a low whimper, a sound so mournful it sent a shiver racing down Elias's spine. The oak loomed above them, its twisted branches casting jagged shadows that danced across the ground like restless spirits. Elias had always thought of it as Clara's tree. She'd spent countless hours beneath it, her presence giving it a warmth that had long since faded. Now, it felt cold, almost menacing, as if it were guarding a secret it didn't want him to uncover. He knelt beside Rusty, his knees protesting as they met the hard earth. Up close, he could see the dog's fur standing on end, bristling along his back like a warning. Rusty's claws scraped at the dirt with a frantic energy, kicking up clumps of soil and exposing the dark, wet underlayer beneath. Elias reached out a hand to calm him, but the dog flinched, his head snapping toward the ground, as if drawn by an invisible force. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Elias muttered, more to himself than to Rusty. His fingers brushed the earth where Rusty had been digging, and he froze. The soil was loose, too loose, like it had been turned over recently. This wasn't the hard-packed ground he'd expected after years of neglect. A memory flickered in his mind, Clara sitting under this very tree, her laughter ringing out as she tossed a stick for Rusty to chase. It had been their spot, a sanctuary in the chaos of life. After her death, Elias had avoided it, unable to bear the sight of the empty space where she'd once been. He'd let the yard grow wild, the grass tangling into knots, the oak standing alone like a silent sentinel. But now, as Rusty's whimpers grew more insistent, Elias felt a pull, a nagging instinct that told him something was wrong, something he'd missed all this time. He brushed at the dirt with his hand, hesitant at first, then with more purpose. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above and carrying a faint earthy scent that made his stomach churn. Rusty stopped digging and sat back, his eyes locked on Elias, watching with an intensity that felt almost human. The soil gave way easily, revealing a shallow hollow beneath the tree's roots. Elias's heart thudded in his chest, a dull, uneven rhythm that matched the pulse of dread creeping through him. His fingers grazed something hard and cold, and he pulled back instinctively, his breath catching in his throat. It was a glint of metal, a small rusted locket, half buried in the dirt. Elias's hands trembled as he lifted it, the chain dangling like a thread of memory. He knew this locket. It was Clara's, the one she'd worn every day of their marriage, a simple oval with a rose etched into its surface. She'd never taken it off, not when she cooked, not when she gardened, not even when she slept. The night she died, it had been missing, and Elias had assumed it was lost in the chaos of her fall. He'd searched for it briefly, then given up, too consumed by grief to care about a trinket. But here it was, buried beneath the oak, its surface tarnished but unmistakable. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Rusty whined again, nudging Elias's arm with his wet nose. The locket felt heavy in his palm, heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of years unspoken. Elias's mind raced. Clara hadn't been out here the night she died. She'd been inside, upstairs when she'd fallen. Or so he'd thought. The doctor had called it an accident, a tragic slip on the worn steps, and Elias had accepted it because the alternative was too painful to consider. But now, doubt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. How had her locket ended up here, buried like a secret? He turned it over in his hands, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. It sprang open with a faint click, revealing a tiny photograph inside. Clara and Elias on their wedding day, smiling at each other with a joy that felt like a lifetime ago. A lump rose in his throat, and tears blurred his vision. He hadn't seen her face like this in years, not since he'd packed away her pictures to spare himself the pain. Rusty pressed closer, his warmth a small comfort against the cold seeping into Elias's bones. The dog's eyes never left the ground, though, and Elias followed his gaze back to the hollow. There was more. Beneath where the locket had lain, the dirt was uneven, hinting at something larger buried deeper. Elias's breath hitched. He didn't want to keep going. He wanted to take the locket, go back inside, and pretend this was all a strange coincidence. But Rusty's presence held him there, an anchor in the storm of his thoughts. The dog's whimpers had softened into a low, steady growl, and the sound sent a chill through Elias. Whatever was under the oak, Rusty knew about it, had known all day, maybe longer, and now Elias couldn't turn away. The sky darkened as clouds rolled in, casting the yard in a muted gray. Elias set the locket aside, his hands shaking as he dug deeper. The soil was cold and damp, clinging to his fingers like it didn't want to let go. Rusty sat still, his growl fading into silence, his eyes wide and unblinking. Elias's heart pounded louder with every handful of earth he moved, a drumbeat of fear and anticipation. He didn't know what he'd find, but he knew it would change everything, because Rusty's relentless cry had led him here, to a truth he'd never dared to face. The sky above Ashwood had turned a bruised shade of purple as evening crept in, the last traces of sunlight swallowed by heavy clouds. Elias knelt beneath the old oak tree, the rusted locket resting in the grass beside him, its open face staring up like a silent witness. His hands were caked with dirt, trembling as they hovered over the shallow hole Rusty had led him to. The little dog sat nearby, his barking finally stilled, replaced by an eerie quiet that felt louder than any sound. Rusty's eyes gleamed in the fading light, fixed on the ground with a knowing intensity that made Elias's skin prickle. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something faintly sour, like decay. Elias's chest tightened as he brushed more soil aside, his fingers scraping against something solid. It wasn't another trinket this time. The object was larger, heavier, and as he pulled it free, he saw it was a wooden box, small, no bigger than a loaf of bread, but weathered and dark with age. Its edges were rough, splintered, and a rusty hinge creaked as he lifted it from the earth. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't something he'd ever seen before, not in all the years he and Clara had lived here. The oak tree had been their place, a sanctuary of shared moments, but this box felt foreign, intrusive, like it didn't belong. Rusty let out a soft whimper, shifting closer, his nose twitching as if he could smell something Elias couldn't. "What is this, boy?" Elias murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He set the box on the ground, wiping his hands on his coat, though the dirt clung stubbornly to his skin. His heart thudded unevenly, a mix of curiosity and dread, swirling in his gut. The locket had been Clara's, a piece of her he'd thought, lost forever, but this box, it felt different. darker. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the lid, every instinct screaming at him to walk away, to leave it buried where it belonged. But Rusty's gaze held him there, steady and unyielding, as if the dog were urging him forward. With a shaky breath, Elias pried the lid open, the hinge groaned, a sound that echoed in the stillness, and a faint musty smell wafted out. Inside lay a bundle of letters, their edges yellowed and curling, tied together with a faded red ribbon. The sight of them hit Elias like a punch to the chest. He recognized the handwriting on the top envelope, instantly. Clara's delicate looping script, the way she curved her letters with a quiet elegance. His name was scrawled across it, Elias. His throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. Clara had written these, hidden them here, and he'd never known. He untied the ribbon with fumbling fingers, the fabric crumbling slightly under his touch. The first letter slipped free, and he unfolded it carefully, as if it might disintegrate in his hands. The words stared up at him, stark against the worn paper. Elias, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. Forgive me, I couldn't tell you the truth. His vision blurred as tears welled up, hot and sudden. Clara's voice seemed to rise from the page, soft and trembling, the way it had been when she was nervous. He read on, each sentence sinking deeper into his heart like a blade. She wrote of a night she'd disappeared for hours, a night Elias vaguely remembered from years ago. He'd been working late at the mill, and when he'd come home, Clara had been quiet, distracted. She'd said she'd gone for a walk, and he'd believed her. Why wouldn't he? They'd trusted each other completely. But the letter told a different story. She'd met someone that night, a stranger, a man with cold eyes, and a voice that chilled her to the bone. He'd known things about their life, things he shouldn't have, the way Elias hummed while fixing the porch, the spot under the oak where Clara read her books. He'd threatened her, though she didn't say why, only that she'd been too afraid to tell Elias, too afraid he'd confront the man and get hurt. The final line made Elias's blood run cold. He's still out there watching. He dropped the letter, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The words echoed in his mind, sharp and menacing, as if the stranger were whispering them into his ear. He looked up, his gaze darting to the woods beyond the house. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying faintly in the wind, but the shadows between them seemed deeper now, alive with possibility. Rusty growled, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground, his ears flattening against his head. Elias followed the dog's stare, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The woods were empty, at least, they seemed to be. But the air felt wrong, charged with a presence he couldn't name. He grabbed the bundle of letters, clutching them to his chest as if they could shield him from the growing dread. Clara had been scared, terrified enough to bury these words, to hide them under the oak where she'd once felt safe. And Rusty had known. The barking, the digging, it wasn't random. The dog had sensed something, maybe even smelled it, lingering in the earth all this time. Elias's mind raced back to the night. Clara died. She'd fallen down the stairs, her body crumpled at the bottom, her eyes staring blankly at nothing. The doctor had said it was an accident, a misstep in the dark, and Elias had accepted it because the grief was too heavy to question. But now, doubt clawed at him, sharp and insistent. The locket, the box, the letters, they painted a picture he didn't want to see. Had Clara been running from something that night? From someone, the stranger she'd written about, the one who'd watched them. Rusty's growl deepened, pulling Elias from his thoughts. The dog was on his feet now, his small body rigid, his eyes locked on the woods. Elias squinted into the darkness, his breath fogging in the cold air. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a flicker of shadow, too tall, too deliberate to be an animal. His stomach dropped, and he scrambled to his feet, the letters slipping from his grasp and scattering across the grass. The wind picked up, rustling the pages, and Clara's words seemed to whisper through the air. He's still out there. The night pressed in around Elias like a living thing, the darkness thick and suffocating as he stood beneath the old oak tree. The scattered letters lay at his feet, their edges fluttering in the wind, each one a fragment of Clara's voice calling out from the past. The wooden box sat open beside them, a silent witness to the secrets it had held for so long. Elias's hands shook as he clutched the locket, its cold metal biting into his palm, grounding him against the storm of emotions tearing through his chest. Rusty stood beside him, his small frame tense, his growl a steady hum that vibrated through the ground. The dog's eyes were fixed on the woods, where the shadow Elias had glimpsed moments ago seemed to linger, just out of sight. Tears streamed down Elias's face, hot and unchecked, as he bent to gather the letters. He couldn't leave them there, exposed to the night. They were all he had left of Clara now, her words a lifeline to the woman he'd loved and lost. He sank to his knees, the damp grass soaking through his pants, and began reading again, desperate to understand. The second letter was shorter, its ink smudged as if written in haste. Elias, he came to the house last week. I saw him through the window, standing under the oak. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd go after him. I can't lose you too. His breath hitched. Clara had been protecting him, shielding him from a danger he hadn't even known existed. The next letter was worse. He knows about Rusty, she'd written. He said he'd hurt him if I didn't do what he wanted. I don't know what he wants, Elias. He just watches, waits. I'm so tired. Elias's heart twisted, a sharp, wrenching pain that made him gasp. Clara had been terrified, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't share, and he'd been oblivious, working late, fixing the truck, living his quiet life while she suffered alone. He pressed a hand to his mouth, stifling a sob. Rusty nudged his arm, whining softly, and Elias pulled the dog close, burying his face in the scruffy fur. She was scared, boy, he whispered. And we didn't know. The final letter was unfinished, the words jagged and uneven. He came back tonight. I hear him outside. Rusty knows. It stopped there, the pen trailing off into a shaky line, as if Clara had been interrupted. Elias's mind reeled, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. The night she died, 3 years ago, under a moonless sky, he'd come home to find her at the bottom of the stairs, her body still warm, Rusty whimpering beside her. The doctor had said she'd tripped, that the old steps were worn and steep, and Elias had believed it because the alternative was unthinkable. But now the truth clawed at him, raw and relentless. She hadn't fallen. She'd been pushed, or worse. He looked at Rusty, the dog's ears twitching as the growl grew louder. You knew, Elias said, his voice breaking. You tried to tell me. Rusty had been there that night, his cries echoing through the house until Elias found them. He'd thought the dog was grieving, but maybe it had been more. Maybe Rusty had seen something, someone lurking in the shadows. The barking today, the digging, it wasn't random. It was a memory, a warning, a plea for Elias to see what Clara couldn't say. The wind howled through the oak, its branches creaking like bones, and Elias's gaze snapped back to the woods. The shadow was still there, he was sure of it now, a tall, deliberate shape moving between the trees. His stomach churned, a mix of fear and rage, boiling inside him. Whoever this man was, whatever he'd done to Clara, he was here, watching, just as she'd written. Elias staggered to his feet, the letters clutched in one hand, the locket in the other. Show yourself, he shouted, his voice raw and ragged, swallowed by the night. Rusty barked once, sharp and fierce, then fell silent, his body pressed against Elias's leg. The air turned colder, the temperature dropping so fast Elias could see his breath fogging in front of him. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes straining to make out the figure. It was closer now, just beyond the edge of the yard, a silhouette against the twisted trunks. Elias's knees trembled, but he didn't back away. This was about Clara, her fear, her pain, her death. He couldn't let it stay buried, not anymore. Rusty's growl deepened, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere primal, and Elias felt the dog's tension ripple through him. They were in this together, bound by the love they'd both had for her. Memories flooded him. Clara's smile as she tossed Rusty a treat, her hand in his as they walked through the village, the quiet nights, by the fire, when words weren't needed. She'd been his world, and he'd failed her, too wrapped in his own routines to see her struggle. The guilt was a knife in his chest, twisting deeper with every breath. But there was something else too, anger hot and fierce, burning away the fear. If this man had taken her, if he'd been the shadow in her letters, Elias wouldn't let him walk away. He took a step forward, Rusty at his side, the dog's ears flat against his head. The shadow shifted, and for a fleeting moment, Elias saw it clearly, a tall figure, gaunt and hollow, moving with a predator's grace. His heart pounded, a drumbeat of terror and resolve. Clara's last words echoed in his mind, Rusty knows. The dog had been her guardian, her silent witness, and now he was Elias's guide, leading him toward a truth too horrible to imagine. The night stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, and Elias knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead, whatever this shadow held, It was the key to Clara's death, and the end of the life he'd known. The night had swallowed Ashwood whole, the darkness so thick it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Elias stood in the yard, the old oak tree looming behind him like a silent judge, its branches swaying in the wind. The letters were scattered at his feet, Clara's words lost to the grass, but her locket burned in his hand, a tether to the love and pain that fueled him now. Rusty growled beside him, the sound low and fierce, his small body coiled with a strength Elias hadn't known the dog possessed. The shadow in the woods was no longer a question. It was real, moving closer, its presence a cold weight that pressed against Elias's chest. He tightened his grip on the locket, the metal digging into his palm, until it drew blood. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and fury. The wind carried his words away, but the shadow paused, then stepped forward, emerging from the trees into the faint moonlight. Elias's breath caught as the figure took shape, a man, tall and gaunt, his face hollowed out by shadows, his eyes glinting like shards of ice. His lips curled into a cruel smile, thin and sharp, and Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "She thought she could hide," the man rasped, his voice rough and dry, like leaves scraping over stone. "But I always find what's mine." The words hit Elias like a blow, echoing the terror in Clara's letters. This was him, the stranger, the watcher, the one who'd haunted her, who'd driven her to bury her fears beneath the oak. Elias's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her confessions. This man had tormented her, threatened her, and now he stood here, unafraid, as if he owned the night. Rusty lunged, a blur of fur and teeth, his bark tearing through the silence. The man moved faster than Elias expected, his arms swinging out with a sickening crack. Rusty yelped, a sharp broken sound, and crumpled to the ground, his small body still. "No!" Elias screamed, the word ripping from his throat as he stumbled forward. He dropped to his knees beside Rusty, his hands hovering over the dog's limp form. Blood matted the fur near Rusty's head, and his chest rose faintly, then stopped. Tears blurred Elias's vision, hot and relentless, as he cradled the dog who'd been his last link to Clara. "You didn't have to do that," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "He was just a dog." The man laughed, a low guttural sound that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. "He was in the way," he said, stepping closer, his boots crunching on the grass. "Just like she was." Elias's head snapped up, the words igniting a fire in his chest. He staggered to his feet, the locket falling to the ground beside Rusty, its chain glinting in the moonlight. "What did you do to her?" he demanded, his voice trembling but hard, fueled by years of buried grief and rage. The man tilted his head, his smile widening. "She didn't fall if that's what you're asking," he said, his tone mocking. "She ran, tried to get away. But stairs are tricky in the dark, aren't they?" Elias's stomach dropped, the confession sinking in like poison. Clara hadn't slipped, she'd been fleeing, chased by this monster, her last moments filled with terror. The image of her body, equal sign body at the bottom of the stairs flashed in his mind, and he saw it now not as an accident, but as a murder, staged to look like a tragedy. The guilt he'd carried, the belief he could have saved her, shattered into a new sharper pain, anger, pure and searing. Elias roared, a sound of anguish and fury, and charged at the man. He didn't care that he was old, that his body ached, that he hadn't fought in decades. He tackled the man to the ground, their bodies crashing into the dirt. The stranger was strong, his limbs wiry and relentless, but Elias fought with the strength of a man who'd lost everything. They grappled, rolling across the yard, fists and elbows striking flesh. The man's laughter turned to grunts, then snarls, as Elias clawed at him, desperation driving every move. In the struggle, Elias's hand found a rock, cold and jagged, buried in the grass. He gripped it, his knuckles white, and swung with all the force he had left. The rock connected with the man's skull, a dull thud that silenced his taunts. Blood sprayed, warm and wet, and the man went limp, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Elias hit him again, until his arm gave out, and the rock slipped from his hand. He collapsed beside the body, gasping, his chest heaving, as the adrenaline drained away. Silence fell, broken only by the rustle of leaves, and Elias's ragged sobs. He crawled to Rusty, pulling the dog into his lap, his tears soaking the matted fur. "I'm sorry," he whispered, rocking back and forth. "I'm so sorry." Rusty had known, had tried to warn him, and now he was gone, sacrificed to reveal the truth. Elias looked at the locket, lying near the man's lifeless hand, and reached for it, clutching it to his chest. Clara's face stared back at him from the tiny photograph, her smile a ghost of the life they'd had. He was alone now, the house behind him, an empty shell, the yard a graveyard of memories. The man was dead, justice delivered by Elias's own hands, but it didn't bring Clara back. It didn't heal the years of pain, the nights he'd spent blaming himself. Rusty's warmth faded, and Elias's sobs grew quieter, swallowed by the night. The truth had been unthinkable. Clara's murder, the killer's return, the cost of vengeance, and it left him hollow, a man broken by love and loss. He sat there, cradling his dog, the locket pressed to his heart, as the wind whispered through the oak, carrying away the last echoes of a life that would never be whole again.